Welcome back to Malden's Revolution. I'm Mark Linehan. 250 years ago today, on August 6, 1775, the British launch a direct assault against Malden, their first foray outside of Boston since the Battle of Bunker Hill. Immediately after the Battle of Bunker Hill, Malden received a large number of refugees from the now destroyed Charlestown, not just because of its proximity, but because Malden was originally part of the town of Charlestown. So many of the refugees seeking assistance were not just neighbors, but kin. But in the days and weeks afterward, a different kind of fugitive arrived in Malden: deserters. Desertion had been a problem in the British Army for some time. The British Army had been occupying the town of Boston since 1768, and for many soldiers, life in Massachusetts had much more appeal than Army life. And now with the war over 3 months old, and with only the Mystic River barely a mile wide as a barrier, there are several accounts of British soldiers swimming across the Mystic and deserting from Charlestown to Malden. But unfortunately, the British aren't the only ones dealing with staffing issues. As the war drags on, we're finding it harder and harder to find volunteers to show up for militia duty. The Malden militia had constructed fortifications up and down the north side of the Mystic River, at Beecham's Point and at the Penny Ferry. A quick note for people who are familiar with this local history and might be confused. The Penny Ferry went from Malden to Charlestown, but there was also the Winnissemmit Ferry that went from Chelsea to Boston. Chelsea had been originally part of Boston, the same way that Malden was originally part of Charlestown. So if you're reading about the Siege of Boston and they talk about a ferry going north, it is much more likely they're talking about the Winnissemmit Ferry than they are the Penny Ferry. The Penny Ferry was created the year settlement in today's Malden began, when on April 2nd, 1640, the inhabitants of Charlestown voted that Philip Drinker, quote, should keep a ferry at the neck of land with a sufficient boat. He could charge 2 pence for one person and 1 pence for each additional person, because even the Puritans charged less for Ubershare. In 1726, the fare was increased to 2 pence per person and 7 pence for a person and their horse. There are many names listed in Malden town records as the operator of the Penny Ferry, but by the time the American Revolution broke out, the operator of the Penny Ferry had been a member of the Sweetser family for 50 years. First, Samuel Sweetser, buried here in Bell Rock Cemetery, and at the time of the American Revolution, that responsibility had passed on to Samuel's son, Stephen. Our old friend Captain Naylor Hatch is in command down here, and this company, while somewhat autonomous, is now part of the Continental Army, and Captain Benjamin Blaney is still in command of the Malden militia. Malden only had a population of approximately 1,000 people, with more than half of that being children, so it's difficult for Malden alone to provide the number of men necessary to guard this vital waterway, and staring at a river all day can get boring. You know, I take that back. This is fantastic. A 26-year-old Danish entrepreneur named Christian Fabiger, a veteran of the Battle of Bunker Hill, reported to General Washington of the sad state of affairs at Malden. Captain Hatch of Colonel Gardner's regiment is there with one company and has to mount 20 men on guard every day without officers. And then they have no sentries on the river, which by the description and situation of the place wants at least 4 sentries every night. As a result of this report, the Malden militia were reinforced by an additional company of men under the command of Captain Eleazar Lindsay, who had been previously stationed in Chelsea under the overall command of Colonel Samuel Garish of Newbury. Garish has the distinction of being the first colonel awarded a commission in the new Massachusetts Army by the Provincial Congress, but his reputation had taken a bit of a hit at the Battle of Bunker Hill. By which I mean, as opposed to Colonel Gardner, who crossed the neck without orders, Colonel Garish, when ordered to fight, apparently started screaming "retreat" as loudly as possible, and was then found by General Israel Putnam lying on the ground complaining he was exhausted and refusing to move. Garish's adjutant took the initiative and led a handful of Garish's men across the neck, but most of the regiment decided not to join the fight. That adjutant was Christian Fabiger, the same man whose accurate report had resulted in Malden getting reinforced, but unfortunately by Fabiger's own regiment, a unit with a stained reputation. Only days after the arrival of Captain Lindsay, the British attacked. Like all battlefield accounts, the events of August 6th are varied, but there is agreement that the British sent floating batteries up the Mystic River. Now, what I originally wrote in my script for today was that I wanted you to imagine barges or docks in the Mystic with cannon mounted on them. What I did not know when I picked this new filming location was that there is a barge in the middle of the Mystic River, right there behind me. That barge that says Anthony's Pier 4 on it, there's a small tugboat docked alongside. That barge is probably about the size of what these floating batteries were. So imagine that right there, without the warehouse buildings on it. Imagine that barge right there with cannon mounted on it, being able to fire on any land target it chooses as it goes up and down the river. These barges potentially were more mobile than horse-pulled artillery on land. So these batteries opened fire on the Malden militia, and then several accounts say 2 sailboats from Charlestown pulled up and landed 50 British regulars. So we have 2 companies of soldiers in Malden, one under Captain Naylor Hatch and the other under Captain Eleazar Lindsay. But a critical thing to remember is that on April 19th, during Lexington and Concord, Malden militia helped capture some supply wagons, and potentially there was some fire exchanged, but we missed out on the Battle of Bunker Hill entirely. So this encounter is, for many of these men, the first real direct contact between Malden's militia and the British Army. Perhaps some of them looked to their continental counterparts for inspiration or leadership. What they saw was their backs. The most detailed account of this incident is in a letter to General George Washington from Lieutenant Colonel Loamy Baldwin of Woburn, serving as second in command to Colonel Garish. According to multiple accounts, including Baldwin's, as soon as the regulars landed, Captain Eleazar Lindsay and his company fled. Several accounts describe his fleeing the scene as being notable because he got ahead of the women and children who were also fleeing. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Baldwin didn't personally witness Captain Lindsay fleeing. He was in Chelsea, and when he heard the British floating batteries firing, he took off to Malden as quickly as he could. And when he got here, Captain Lindsay and most of his men were nowhere to be found. With many of the men assigned to guard the Penny Ferry gone, the regulars were able to burn the Penny Ferry building. When Lieutenant Colonel Baldwin got to Malden, he was able to convince Captain Lindsay's second in command, Lieutenant Galuchet, to rally the remaining men despite his commander's cowardice. This must have been awkward for Lieutenant Galuchet, since Captain Lindsay was not just his commanding officer. He was also his father-in-law. Eventually, the remaining soldiers from both Malden and their neighbors were able to beat the British back, and the British Army retreated across the Mystic. There are no reports of any Americans being killed or wounded. However, we do have reports that several wounded British soldiers were evacuated to Boston. The British have attacked Malden, and our response was less than inspiring. So what's stopping the British from coming back? What if next time they head up the Malden River and strike the heart of the town? Will cowards like Captain Lindsay and Colonel Garish suffer any consequences? See you soon.